Morning, Shu. Now, not many people have a lot of natural sympathy for politicians. But right now, they're facing a truly agonising decision. Unlock the country on the 21st, despite a sharp rise in infections, or pause, fudge, and potentially infuriate millions. Getting that wrong could, on the one side, bankrupt thousands of businesses and ruin almost everyone's summer, or, on the other hand, potentially kill thousands of British people. The senior government advisor Jeremy Farrers called this perhaps the hardest UK policy decision of the last 18 months. Now, if Boris Johnson had the hard facts to make a fully informed, rational decision, it wouldn't be so difficult. But, my friends, he doesn't. And so, joining me to discuss the latest on whether the vaccines are doing their job, and fresh from his verbal machine gunning from Dominic Cummings, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Ahead of the meeting of the G7 world leaders in Cornwall next week, I'll be speaking to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, and the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Plus, with a major revolt of Tory MPs on the cards tomorrow on foreign aid, I've been talking to Sir Bob Geldof. A protein-rich hour, not many carbohydrates. Reviewing the news, Jo Coburn of BBC Politics Live fame and the deputy political editor of the Daily Telegraph, Lucy Fisher. But first, the news from Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. A memorial to British and Commonwealth troops who died on D-Day is to be officially opened in Normandy today on the 77th anniversary of the landings. The monument honours the more than 22,000 servicemen who died on the day and in the fighting which followed. The government is urging pupils in England to take COVID tests before returning to school after the half-term break. It comes as the Health Secretary warned that a huge proportion of the latest COVID cases are in children. More than 1,000 charities, business leaders and academics have written to the government asking it to reverse the decision to cut foreign aid this year. It comes after the government said that it would still spend more than £10 billion in foreign aid this year. It's the BAFTAs Awards ceremony pandemic style later today. The stars will be back on the red carpet, but some will just be holograms. The ceremony will be broadcast here on BBC One, celebrating the best on-screen talent and TV programmes of 2020. And Rory Burns has been battling for England. He scored a century, but the home side still have work to do as New Zealand have the edge going into the final day of the opening test match at Lord's. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks for that. And now, as ever, to the front pages. And this is a Sunday morning where the editors have different views about what matters most. A couple of stories on vaccines. The Sunday Telegraph there planned to jab 12-year-olds before the new school year. That's quite a controversial policy, and we'll talk about that with Matt Hancock, I'm sure, later in the programme. The Observer has got the story, share vaccines or the climate deal around the world will fail, rich countries are told. That's in the context of Boris Johnson there in the Sunday Times wanting to jab the whole world by the end of next year. Their splash is about Prince William being sent to Scotland to save the Union. Other stories around, political stories around, Mail on Sunday, migrants. The Mail on Sunday is very anxious and angry about the number of people who are coming across the channel at the moment. And the Home Office, Priti Patel, responds with a story to the paper saying that she is pinning the blame on Facebook and TikTok, who are advertising the joys of crossing the channel and a life in England all around the world. They say 800,000 people watched one TikTok story. A different story here from the Sunday Express, going back to this week's big news from the Treasury and that new deal over corporate tax around the world. Britain steps up to lead the world, it says. A new tax deal as Boris urges leaders to jab the globe by the end of 2022. That there again. And finally, the same story, but a slightly different take from the Sunday Mirror. Give tax billions to NHS and schools. Of course, we don't actually know yet exactly how much money this new tax would raise, or even the rate that it's going to be at. But they're saying all that money should go straight to schools and the NHS. So much to talk about. Let's start, Jo, with with the vaccine stories which are everywhere.
Yes, they are. But let's have a look at this one, particularly on the front page of the Sunday Times. It is in most of the newspapers. It says, let's jab the world by end of next year, Prime Minister says. Now, this is an eye-catching pledge timed for the opening of the G7 summit of world leaders later this week. Now, you'd expect the Prime Minister would want this headline. Is it achievable, is
That's
the question.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about vaccinating the world, which certainly is a bold ambition, by the end of 2022. We know that there are figures that say that the UK has ordered enough vaccines to vaccinate the population twice over. Do they want to look at diverting more of their vaccines when they come? They've been criticised for not doing so enough, the UK and other richer nations, because the lesson of variants from various parts of the world where they haven't been vaccinated as much as the UK has shown that that danger will remain and could continue over the next year or so, as one scientist called it a petri dish, literally, for variants.
It's a real difficult policy choice again. Vaccinate everybody here and protect us, or start to send vaccines around the world to protect the entire world community.
Absolutely.
Very, very interesting. Let's turn, Lucy, to some of the other there's two other big vaccine stories in the paper. One sort of picking up from that same theme on the front page of The Observer, and a really difficult moral dilemma also on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph.
Yes, well, on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph is the revelation that Whitehall officials have already begun to draw up the vaccination rollout plan for 12 to 15-year-olds from the end of August. Now, before that can get started, it needs for the Pfizer jab, which received approval this week from the medicines regulator, to receive further green light from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation to use it on children. It's a really difficult ethical dilemma because, of course, children do transmit COVID. We know that. So vaccinating them would potentially help cut the case rates. But at the same time, children don't tend to suffer from serious disease from COVID. So we could be subjecting them to potential side effects from the jab without them receiving that sort of personal protection that older cohorts get from the vaccine. So really tricky balance for the government to consider on this one.
Lots and lots of ethical choices here, Jo. Another one is Tony Blair, who's coming onto this programme in a moment. And he's very keen on the idea of vaccine passports, and that's made a big story in The Observer.
Yes, it's here. Blair calls for new pass to allow vaccinated people more freedoms. As you say, again, it is about choices. And there are many people in politics asking what is the point of having a double vaccination and not being allowed more freedom? Yeah. Why not have a grading system in some way? But it is controversial because there's already been a big political discussion about the idea of having vaccine passports to enter into domestic hospitality venues, for example, which actually was sort of considered and looks as if it may have been put to one side because it would lead to a two-tier system.
To be clear, sorry, to jump in, there's lots and lots of people who, for different reasons, have not been vaccinated, either that they're slightly too young, or they're disabled, or they're from communities who are highly sceptical about vaccination.
And that is where the controversy lies. Would it be fair? Would it lead to a system that would disadvantage certain parts of the community? But here is Tony Blair, and I'm sure you will ask him all about this, saying that it should allow more freedoms if you have been double vaccinated until such time that the link between infection and hospitalisation is completely broken. It's been loosened, some say it's severed, but completely broken. And he goes into some detail in his piece.
All right, Lucy, let's turn to another aspect of all of this, which is Britain and the rest of the world. There's possibly a really big Tory revolt coming in the House of Commons tomorrow over the proposed cut in the aid budget from 0.7%, which is in the law, to 0.5%, at least for a time. A, do you think, you've got your ear to the ground, do you think this amendment's going to be called? Is it going to be a confrontation? And B, perhaps harder still, what's going to happen?
Well, yes, it's in the balance, but my understanding is that the rebels have been in cahoots with the parliamentary clerks. They have drawn up this amendment very carefully to ensure that it is within the scope of the bill it has been amended to. That is a legislation to create a new science funding and research funding agency. What the rebels want to do is force the government to divert the cash allocated for that back to the aid budget. So my sense is that Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Commons Speaker, will call that amendment tomorrow. And the rebels are feeling very bullish. You know, Andrew Mitchell, former Chief Whip, he knows how to corral backbenchers. Like any chief whip, he'll never discuss numbers, but there is a lot of cautious optimism on the rebel side that they will have the numbers tomorrow, including Theresa May, former Prime Minister, lots of big names on their side, Select Committee chairmen and women. And the timing could not be worse for the government. The week of the G7, with world leaders from wealthy democracies flying in, the embarrassment that they could cause Boris Johnson is acute.
Yes, and Jo, you wonder whether Boris Johnson will find some way of avoiding that, either offering a fudge of some kind or a compromise, or possibly just changing his mind. Bob Geldof, I've been talking to, he's on the programme shortly, appealing to Boris Johnson directly, change your mind on this. You know it doesn't make sense.
Well, there is a compromise talked about in this piece here with the headline, Cameron accused of lobbying against Prime Minister over foreign aid cuts. I mean, it's interesting because you have to think back to David Cameron as Prime Minister. It was a defining policy for him to make this pledge of spending 0.7% of the UK economy on foreign aid. It was sort of part of detoxifying, as they saw it, the Conservative brand.
And it's in the law. It's part of the law.
It is, but of course the government would say these are different times, and they think they've got voters on their side. Polling has been done about this, but they cite in this particular piece here a poll that says 2/3 of voters are actually in favour of reducing that 0.7% pledge to 0.5. The government has said it wouldn't be forever, but of course how long is a piece of string? The compromise is from Andrew Mitchell, who Lucy just mentioned there, former International Development Secretary, saying make it a year. If you pledge to make it for just a year, we could perhaps consider that, and then we will support it.
Very, very interesting. And Lucy, the Telegraph, it's pretty clear what the Sunday Telegraph thinks about this. There's a pretty ferocious, tightly argued piece by Esther McVey in favour of the government and against the rebels on this. And there's a very ferocious leader as well. Their main leader, I think, is on this.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Well, Esther McVey, a former welfare secretary, a blistering article in the Sunday Telegraph today in which she points out that public sector net debt has already reached more than 2.1 trillion and that charity needs to start at home. She argues that money would be better spent on NHS waiting lists and funding an education catch-up package. And she says that, you wouldn't advise a neighbour to go into debt to make a donation to charity, and the same is true of the country. And I'll just read this final paragraph of the leader you mentioned, Andrew, in the Sunday Telegraph, in which the paper argues, Britain is good at private charitable donations and investment in the developing world and has helped fight global poverty by championing free trade and the free movement of capital. That's what true philosophical conservatives should focus on, not courting left-wing dinner party approval.
Certainly not left-wing dinner party approval, almost certainly in North London, I imagine, Jo. Now, moving on to another big story, front page of the Mail on Sunday, if I could direct you towards that, if you don't mind.
Yes, well, if you go in, well, it's inside the pages too, but it says number 10 fears blackmail by Williamson. They're talking about Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, as he faces acts in reshuffle. Now, this is a classic Westminster Insiders piece, makes for very interesting reading because it's about the shenanigans and behind the scenes that goes on ahead of any reshuffle. We don't know exactly when a reshuffle is going to happen.
It's going to happen this year.
Undoubtedly, I think. And also, Gavin Williamson has been a figure, also a former chief whip, and any attempt to move him, they're saying he could blackmail the Prime Minister with the secrets he knows.
And just finally, a very short but very interesting piece in The Sun on Sunday today, because we're all talking about Freedom Day on the 21st. Is it going to happen or not?
Well,
and The Sun has a different date.
It does. There's Boris Johnson. Freedom Day move to July the 5th. All sorts of talk over the past few weeks about whether or not the race to vaccinate as many people as possible in the UK and indeed double vaccinate them may need a few more weeks in order to secure what they say is Freedom Day, so it may come late.
If you haven't read it first, you heard it here first. Jo, Lucy, thanks both very much indeed for that. Great fun. Well, not fun, but you know what I mean. The weather. I suppose even by British standards, surprising is a word to use. Glorious across much of the country and then drenching for parts of the south. Are we inching into proper summer? Over to Darren Bett. Darren.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got a more typical summer weather pattern over the week ahead. Today, the best of the weather is probably going to be in Scotland and here in Northern Ireland, where we've got some sunny spells. For parts of England in particular, there's much more cloud around, and we've already seen some rain and drizzle in the West Midlands. More of that to come through parts of the Midlands, heading into parts of Northern England through the rest of the day. Further south, it may well brighten up, but that could trigger some heavy showers, perhaps. Probably staying dry, though, for Scotland and Northern Ireland with some sunny spells. Temperatures here 17 or 18 degrees. May get up to around 21 or 22 towards the southeast, where we've got some brighter skies for a while. But even here, the threat of some showers, and those showers continue into this evening before pushing away into the North Sea overnight. It does become dry overnight. Some more mist and fog patches around where we'll have the clearer skies for longer in Scotland. This is where we'll have the lowest temperatures. Tomorrow should start dry. There'll be some sunshine. The mist and fog will tend to lift. Will trigger, though, a few heavy showers, though, in the afternoon, all the way from East Anglia northwards into the northeast of England, perhaps 1 or 2 into eastern Scotland. The further west you are, the better chance you have of staying dry tomorrow with some spells of sunshine. Temperatures tomorrow similar to those of today. Now to this more typical summer weather pattern, and over the week ahead, northwestern parts of the UK with the Atlantic breeze, we'll see more cloud breeze, chance of rain to the southeast. It'll be dry, sunnier, and it's going to get warmer as well.
That's all good news, Darren. Thanks very much indeed. Now, next weekend, world leaders are going to be meeting in Cornwall for the G7 summit in Carbis Bay. It's a chance for the UK to set the agenda, and Boris Johnson wants to use it to agree a plan to vaccinate the billions of people in poorer countries without access to jabs. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, is with me now. Mr. Blair, you've been advising ministers in public and in private. Looking at all the data you can see, do you think we're going to open up on the 21st of June?
I think it's uncertain at the moment, and the paper we're putting out today is saying we should really distinguish between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So both here at home, if we do have to adjust some of the freedoms because of the rising pressure from new variants, then it's important at least to ensure that those people who are vaccinated have the maximum freedom they can. And I think that could also be done for travel as well.
Is it acceptable to turn down a vaccine, do you think?
Unless you've got a good medical reason, my view very clearly is no. And I think that's why it's important to give people a real incentive to get vaccinated. Because, you know, if you are vaccinated, the evidence is absolutely clear. It reduces the risk of transmission and it reduces the risk of hospitalisation or death.
So would you make them mandatory?
I don't think you can make them mandatory, but I think, and this is what we're suggesting today, by making it clear that, for example, if you are vaccinated, if you're double vaccinated, it should be much easier to come in and out of the country. And indeed, round the world, I think you will find that countries start to distinguish between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So in Europe, for example, they're going to allow you to travel freely within Europe if you're double vaccinated.
The trouble is, this does create, does it not, a two-tier society between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Looking at your own paper says that if you haven't been vaccinated, you won't be able to go to nightclubs and theatres and big sporting events and many other places. So you will be discriminated against.
Yeah, but I think, you know, the word discrimination's got a very loaded meaning in the English language now. But really, when it comes to risk management, it's all about discrimination. So the reason we vaccinate elderly people first is they're more at risk. The reason why we ensure that people are vaccinated is because it then reduces the risk of transmission, not merely of you getting ill yourself, but of you passing on the disease. So I think since everybody's going to be able to get the vaccination, other than those, as I say, who for medical reasons can't, then I think it really is important that people get encouraged to get vaccinated. And we also make suggestions as to how we can make sure you get proper proof of vaccination. I mean, actually, the NHS ex-people have done a good job in the NHS app, but we need to make that interoperable with other systems so that you can use this as proof of vaccination throughout the world.
I use the word discrimination advisedly because we know that people from ethnic minorities are less likely to be vaccinated. So figures saying among the over 50s, there is on average 25% less vaccine take-up among black people than white people. Now, that is discrimination if you're going to push them into a second
the
tier.
answer to that, Andrew, is to encourage people from that community to get vaccinated. And one other thing I think is very important, particularly in the context of the call to vaccinate the world by the end of 2022.
But But might this not have exactly the opposite effect? I mean, there's a very interesting Sage paper about the hostility to government generally and the suspicion of government generally in these groups. It says, and I'm quoting, that because of historical issues and contemporary perceptions of institutional racism, it's much harder to persuade these groups to take the vaccine. And telling them they have to, or they're going to be kept out of sporting events and many other places, is simply going to make them feel angrier, not less.
I'm not sure about that. I really think if you explain the facts to people, they can see the value of getting vaccinated. Now, one other thing I've asked for over these last weeks, and I still think we should do this, is that we are in I'm going to say unique, I think virtually unique position as a country of vaccinating at scale using both the messenger RNA vaccine, that's Pfizer, and an adenovirus vaccine, more traditional type of vaccine, AstraZeneca. I think rather than putting the data out in percentage risk reduction, if we were to publish the overall figures showing the numbers vaccinated with each, the numbers of those that still got COVID, the numbers of those hospitalized, the numbers of those died, as, for example, they do in Israel, I think the impact would be dramatic, not just here in Britain, but round the world. Because one of the biggest problems, by the way, in getting the world vaccinated is there's now a resistance to the AstraZeneca vaccine that I think is completely unjustified on the data. And if we did publish the data in that way, I think you would see very clearly both, one, that vaccines are massively effective in reducing the disease, and two, that AstraZeneca and Pfizer are roughly similar.
So that's a public communication thing, really. Can I just bring you back to the plan for vaccine passports? Or passes. This needs buy-in from the industry, in particular the hospitality industry. And the truth is they don't like the idea. Kate Nichols, who's CEO of Hospitality UK, says that vaccine passports would be unworkable and cause conflict between the staff and customers. She surely knows her industry better than you do.
Yeah, but I think you're not mandating this, you're facilitating it. So I think that there may well be situations in which people decide they don't want to make that distinction. But I think you're going to find in many settings, people do want to know if they're going into that setting that the people around them, if they're mixing in close quarters, have been vaccinated. And I think, when you look around the world at some of the best practice on this, it's very, very clear that in the end, it's not just going to be something that government does. The consumer, the citizen, has also got a voice in this.
One last group that really concerns me, I'd like to hear your views on, are disabled people with autoimmune problems in particular, who can't be vaccinated. Surely this is grossly unfair to them. They have a hard enough time already.
Right, so you've got to make special provision, because obviously that would be completely inappropriate to discriminate against them. It's a relatively small group of people, but you need special provision for those. I'm 100% sympathetic to that. What I'm not sympathetic to are people who are able to get the vaccine and just refuse to get it.
This whole argument reminds me of something going back for some years. This is ID cards by the back door, isn't it?
Look, I was then, I remain even more convinced today, particularly with biometric technology, the world will move to biometric ID, and they'll do it because in the end it's better for people. It's not about, look, the amount of information government's going to have on you is going to be minimal compared with what your local supermarket has on you. So this is a completely sensible way to go, and I think you will find right round the world that people move in this direction because it will facilitate the access to government services. And by the way, in some of the developing countries, it will cut out fraud.
You're very plugged in. Are ministers interested in this, do you think?
I mean, I don't know, but I hope so, because it's just an obvious change. And the thing is about biometric ID, I mean, as you know, my view is the whole world's getting changed by technology. The big political debate we should be having, we're not really having it, is how do you master this technology and harness it for the public good? But in every single field of our work, our leisure, the way we interact with each other, technology is going to change everything. So, biometric ID is just one part of a much, much bigger picture.
Do you think, again, it's in some respects an ethical or moral dilemma, do you think we should be vaccinating children to protect the entire society?
Yes, I think you're definitely moving that direction in the end. And I think, it's already been shown, I think, in studies that, 12 to 18-year-olds will get vaccinated.
And you've also said you want us to vaccinate the whole world, help vaccinate the whole world by the end of this year. So it's a question of priorities and choices. Which matters more? Vaccinating everybody in the UK first or starting to send vaccinations around the world?
Look, it's important when you're outside of government not to advocate something you know you wouldn't do inside government.
Exactly.
So, the priority will always be first to get your own country vaccinated, and we're doing that. What we're saying is you won't be able to vaccinate the whole world in 2021. You will be able to do it, as Boris Johnson's saying today, by the end of 2022. But what you could do by the end of this year is vaccinate the most vulnerable. And that means frontline healthcare workers, the elderly, and those around big urban conurbations. And the reason for doing that is enlightened self-interest. It's not humanitarian simply. It's because it helps us to stop the disease spreading.
So in your view, Boris Johnson should go to the G7 and say, we're going to vaccinate everybody in the UK first, but then we're going to send as much vaccines as possible around the world.
Yes, and I think that's what they will do. I mean, look, you can't be absolute about this. There may be some vaccine that we can ship out in advance of that, But no, the reality is countries, your government's obliged to look after your own people. But in order to get this vaccination of the world, by the way, and we set this out in a paper recently, a very good independent scientific experts report for the G7, just published a few days back. To do this properly, however, you're going to need to keep production going. You're going to need to make sure that countries have the capacity to absorb and to vaccinate, because many of them presently don't. And you're going to have to make sure you overcome the hesitancy about vaccines.
You have been following the detail all the way through this pandemic very closely. Do you think it originated in a wet market or from a lab? Go on.
I've literally no idea.
So it could have come from a lab?
Well, I think, look, I know no more than you know or anyone reading the newspapers. I mean, I think you just got to keep an open mind on it. But it's not something, I haven't really focused on that, to be absolutely frank, because I'm not an expert on that type of thing, and I just don't know. But what I do know is that if we're going to face this situation in the future, we're going to have to create a global infrastructure to deal with future pandemics, because I think what has happened to us is probably part of a change that is going to be just normal life for the foreseeable future.
Tony Blair, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now then, joining me from Salford and listening to that, I hope, is the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Your former leader, Tony Blair, is very much in favour of vaccine passports. Your current leader says it's against the instincts of the British people. What is your own personal view?
I'm quite sceptical about domestic vaccine passports. I think the global case for vaccine passports is clear because other countries are already doing it. But at a domestic level, we've still, for many of the reasons that you highlighted, the discriminatory practices, how they would actually practically be enforced, I think there are potentially real problems. Where I totally agree with Tony Blair is that we've just got to get the economy opened up again and get things moving again. But the quickest and best way to do that is to get the vaccine rolled out to people across this country. Many people, particularly young people, still haven't had it. We've got huge problems in parts of the country, including here in the northwest, where Blackburn, Bury have been asking the government for additional doses, for additional support that hasn't been forthcoming. We've got to fix these problems, get the vaccine rolled out. That's the quickest way that we can start opening things up.
I guess at the heart of that is whether people who've been double vaccinated should be treated in any way differently from anybody else. Now, France has said that double vaccinated British people are welcome to come there on holiday quite shortly and they won't need to face quarantining. Do you think they should be facing quarantining as they come back again?
Well, I think we've got a real problem with the travel system that the government has put in place. We've currently got countries on the amber list, which the government is basically urging people not to go to, but allowing people to go to with very lax quarantine requirements when they come back.
So you want tougher ones?
Yeah, we think the amber list should be scrapped. We think it's pointless. We think it's confusing, and that confusion is actually dangerous at the moment. It risks unravelling all of the progress that we've made.
To be clear, do you think that people who've gone on holiday or go on holiday to France and then come back should be quarantined?
Look, I think that we should have robust quarantine measures in place for people coming back into the country.
All right,
that's
absolutely
yes.
Okay.
That's absolutely right. But I also think that we need to be much clearer with people that at the moment, travelling overseas, particularly when you've got countries like Thailand and Vietnam on the amber list, where new variants are emerging and being imported into the UK, is the wrong thing to do. And the government ought to be absolutely clear about that.
Right, let's turn to the subject which almost everybody watching is obsessed by, which is, are we going to end the restrictions on the 21st of June or not? If we stand back, we know that infections went up by 3/4 in the last week, for which there's figures available, and that they're running very, very high now compared to even to March. What is your view? Looking at all the data, should we be looking at unlocking then or not?
Well, we don't have access to as much data as the government, but based on what we do know, it's looking very difficult at the moment. We've got Blackburn, Bury, Bolton in the northwest, Wigan, where I live, that are seeing rising infection rates, particularly amongst young people, which are driving a lot of the transmission. We've got areas that have run out of vaccine. We've got frontline health officials being ignored again by the government when they've requested help. If we're going to unlock on the 21st, and I'd love us to be able to do it, like everybody else, I'm absolutely desperate to get back to normal. So we've got to get the vaccine rolled out much more quickly, and that means the government has got to start listening to people on the front line. I
guess people sitting in parts of Yorkshire and Hampshire and Wales and Scotland will be asking, should the country have to wait until Wigan is all right and Bolton is all right before we unlock? We're all desperate to get back.
But look, we've been here before and we had rising infection rates in some parts of the country. We had local lockdowns that just simply didn't work. And then we saw rising infection rates across every nation and region of the United Kingdom. We can't afford to be there again.
So do you think it should be an England only and then a Britain only approach? In other words, everybody moves together?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I don't think that local lockdowns work, but I think more importantly, we have to listen to people on the front line about what is happening in their local areas. Bolton were saying weeks ago, let us vaccinate everybody over the age of 18. Blackburn have made a similar request. Bury have asked for a package of help. None of this has been forthcoming from the government. How can it be that 14 months after we first started to wake up to the reality of this virus, the government is still not listening to people who are telling them that they need support right now?
So Public Health England shows that has got data showing that the virus is running quite fast through schools at the moment, and we've been told that the Pfizer vaccine is safe for children. Do you think children should now be vaccinated?
Yeah, I think the regulator was absolutely clear that for 12-year-olds and over, the Pfizer vaccine is safe. And it's becoming apparent that the rise in transmission rates is being driven amongst younger people, not just school-aged children, but secondary school-aged children as well. So I think that it is right to follow the public health officials, particularly those in areas that are saying this is what they want to do. I think the government ought to be listening to people on the front line. You know, this week we've got the most important G7 summit in a generation, being hosted by the UK. The Prime Minister is rightly saying he wants to get the world vaccinated. We've got to do our bit here in Britain to break the transmission cycle. We've got one of the highest death tolls in the world because of the failure to get a grip on the virus, and we can't continue to make these same mistakes.
So this is a really important, as it were, new policy. Labour Party agrees with the public health officials and indeed with the teaching unions that children should be vaccinated to help preserve their education and to help the rest of us.
I think you have to listen to what people are saying on the front line. If public health directors in areas are saying, look, we've got to open up the vaccine to 18 plus, as they did a few weeks ago, we ought to listen and respond to that. If they're saying we've got a problem in our secondary schools and we need to open up the vaccine, not to make it mandatory, but to open it up, the chance for young people to be vaccinated, then we ought to listen and respond to those public health officials as well. If we'd taken that approach at the beginning, we would be in a far better place now.
So there's a drive by some people to have children vaccinated by the end of August, beginning of September, at the beginning of the new school year. But there's clearly also a kind of big ethical, moral choice again, which is, should you vaccinate all the people in Britain, including children, first? Or should you send those vaccines as they arrive to the third world, as will be urged at the G7, I'm sure?
Well, look, we've ordered 400 million doses of the vaccine in the UK, so there are going to be surplus vaccines that we can make available. And I listened to Tony Blair. I think he was right to say, for example, frontline health workers, it makes sense to make sure that they're vaccinated in other countries. But this isn't a zero-sum game. We've got the virus out of control in some parts of our own country, and we have a responsibility not just to our own citizens, but to the world to do something to break that transmission cycle as well. We know that the virus mutates in areas where there's very high prevalence. So this is a really, really critical contribution that Britain can make, is to get a grip on the virus.
And you're quite right that we have ordered as a country a huge number of vaccines, but they haven't arrived yet. They're not here yet. And therefore, for the time being, there is a choice to be made. And Dr. Tedros, who's head of the World Health Organization, he says, I understand why some countries want to vaccinate their children and adolescents. But right now, I urge them to reconsider and to instead donate vaccines to COVAX, which is the international vaccine distribution. So which comes first?
Well, look, it can't be an either-or, because if it's a zero-sum game, then we're all going to lose. You know, saying that we've got to vaccinate people everywhere or we're not safe anywhere isn't just a slogan, it's a fact. And we've seen the terrible consequences of that fact over the last few months, particularly in India, and then the Indian variant arriving here in the UK. We've got to ramp up production capacity, and we could do that relatively quickly. This week at the G7 is the chance to reach that global agreement about how we're going to do that around the world. The Prime Minister has said in the last 24 hours that he wants to do that. Other countries have been far more ambitious about the proposals that they've put forward, but this is the week where we've got to agree a plan to do that and get production capacity ramped up in parts of the world where there just simply isn't access to the vaccine at all at the moment.
Lisa Nandy, thanks very much for getting up on a glorious summer morning and joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now then, as the founder of Live Aid, Bob Geldof's become synonymous with campaigning for those in need around the world. He was instrumental in the UK first agreeing to dedicate 0.7% of GDP to aid abroad. We're still one of the very few countries to ever reach that figure. And he's advised both Labour and Conservative governments on poverty. As a potential Tory rebellion looms on the government's plan to reduce aid to 0.5%, I put to him that a temporary cut to foreign aid spending during the throes of a pandemic does make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense economically, financially, politically, diplomatically, of course, morally, or in the humanitarian consequences of it. And I'm very much afraid that something that we're told is temporary will become permanent. And that would be vastly damaging for Britain's soft power, for its reputation, particularly at a weekend when we invite the world's most powerful leaders and the world's biggest economies to come here and talk about such matters with us. It seems remarkably maladroit and inept.
OK, well, let's look at one specific example, if we could. The government has given schools £3.1 billion out of £15 billion its own advisor said was now necessary to recover from the pandemic. And the cost of the 0.2% is £4 billion. So why should that money be sent abroad when we desperately need it to help children recover their education here?
Well, none of the money that would come from that, which is far too little for British education, will be sent abroad, of course. And charity must begin at home, Andrew. That's a given. But we spend somewhere in the region of 600 billion around health, education and welfare. What we're talking about is in total 4 billion. So our GDP is roughly around 2.2 trillion. That's 220,000 billion. 220,000 billion. This, our fifth richest country in the world, generates. This isn't about left or right. This isn't about Labour, Tory. This is a continuum of political intent. So what Labour started, the Tories achieved. And they not only achieved it, but they put it into their promise, into their election manifesto of 2019. They promised the electorate that they would maintain this.
So what are the real world consequences of this cut?
Not a single Rohingya refugee has been vaccinated against COVID. And yet in this part of the world is where the variants are spreading, whether it's the new Nepalese variant or the India variant, not a single person. And yet we promised millions to help achieve that. That's gone. AIDS, polio, malnutrition, we cut that by 80%. And left and right in Parliament, there's a coalition to stop them beating up the poor. We don't do that. We just don't take the piece of bread from that child's mouth in Yemen. We don't do it. We don't snatch the one textbook it's ever had in its life from its only tin shack school. We don't fire the teachers and the nurses from the tin shack hospitals. And it is not in our interest to do that. We don't do that. It's political misfiring. It neuters our diplomacy, it emasculates us. Morally, it just isn't defensible. I mean, if you look at the papers today, from across the board, Tories from all stripes within the party are saying, let's forget this. This isn't us. Tory voters are essentially prudent, but they're not cruel. This is cruel.
So your message to Boris Johnson is, if he's watching this, change your mind.
Yeah, I don't think he's committed to it. And, there's an expansiveness there that can be called upon in his mind. And yes, I am saying, Prime Minister, what's this about? You are going to meet your peers at the weekend. This is one we lead on already, seriously lead on. We led the charge. We committed to it. The entire country, through their MPs, promised it. Go in there with our head held high.
Bob Geldof, thank you. And the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, is with me in the studio listening to that. This is not who you are. It's time to change your minds, isn't it?
Well, I think it is reasonable at a time of this enormous economic challenge, as well as, of course, the health challenge, to take this action. And if you think about it, we've had
what you've heard?
We've had a once in 300 years economic interruption, and there's so many things that we can do to support the whole world to get out of this. For instance, the Prime Minister's leadership in driving for the whole world to be vaccinated by the end of next year, which I hope we can achieve a G7 agreement on, plus the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is being delivered at cost, two-thirds of that in low and middle income countries. Those two things don't count within this technical definition of ODA. But what does matter is that we have to support the world to get out of this, but we also have a very significant fiscal and economic challenge at home. We have to address both.
But this is, at the moment, the 0.7%, it's not just a figure. It was in your manifesto on which you stood. It's in the law. And many people will say, who are the real rebels in this? Are they the Tory MPs voting to uphold their manifesto and uphold the law, or the government ministers voting against them? I put it to you, I take your point about this being an exceedingly difficult economic interruption. Have you thought about limiting this, for instance, to just 1 year?
Well, this proposal is to be temporary.
It is.
It is proposed to be a temporary change. Yes, but we also have this, this enormous cost here that we have to deal with, so that we can keep investing, for instance, in the NHS and expanding that investment, which we are doing. But also, part of my argument is there's many more things that we are doing around the world. Leadership on climate change is about supporting less developed countries, and certainly the work that AstraZeneca and Oxford University have done, meaning that a quarter of the vaccines delivered so far around the whole world are ones that have been delivered with UK taxpayers' cash, Oxford University, AstraZeneca, at cost, no charge for the intellectual property. And that is saving lives right now everywhere.
Let's turn to the agonising choice ahead about the 21st of June. It's a really, really difficult decision. I think people understand that now. With the information you've got, how much more transmissible is the Delta variant?
Well, the best estimate of the growth advantage, as we call it, of the Delta variant from SAGE is around 40%. So
40%.
That does make life more challenging for everybody. And you've seen that the case rates have risen a little. But the good news is that the hospitalisations, the number of people arriving at hospital, is broadly flat. And the majority appear to be those who have not had a vaccine at all, and only a very small minority are people who've had both jabs. So what the best scientific advice I have at this stage is that after one jab, it's not quite as effective against the new Delta variant, but after both jabs, it is. So that's why it's so important that we drive through these vaccinations and people come forward for their second jab.
Just picking up on that 40% figure, because there's some good news in what you said there. SAGE said on the 13th of May, they said, if this variant were to have a 40 to 50% transmission advantage, which you say it probably does have, it is likely that progressing with step 3 alone, the 17th of May, would lead to a substantial resurgence of hospitalisations similar to or larger than previous peaks. Progressing with both steps 3 and 4 at the earliest dates could lead to a much larger peak. but you think they're wrong.
Well, that's a few weeks ago, and we've got more data since then. And the thing that we're watching incredibly carefully is, of course, the case rate, but also the rate in which that translates into hospitalisations. And thankfully, that link, which was absolutely rock solid, sadly, over the autumn, that link now is, I've said it's severed but not broken. There are some people in hospital who've been double vaccinated, but very few.
Very few.
The majority of people in hospital haven't, and critically, those who are double vaccinated also appear to be, even if they're in hospital, appear to be less seriously ill. So, the vaccine is working and it is our way through it, but the new variant, because it's more transmissible, is obviously making that calculation harder. And we'll look at the data for another week and then make a judgment.
If the data turns bad, would you delay the 21st of June openings?
Well, we're absolutely open to doing that if that's what it needs to happen. We said in the roadmap that the 21st of June is the date by which we would not take step 4 before that date, and we'd look at the data. That's exactly what we're doing. So the roadmap was set up in order to be able to take these sorts of changes into account.
And moving away from the actual data itself, but further ahead, could we see a situation where we retain some restrictions, for instance, on the use of masks and the advice to work from home, if at all possible, while leaving everything else open?
Yes, I wouldn't rule that out. I mean, the way that we are looking at this is that step 4 it involves the removing of some of the remaining social restrictions, like the rule of 6 and some of the business closures which are still there. Separately, we have a piece of work on what the social distancing rules should be after that, whether we should have the sort of certification that Tony Blair was just talking about.
That's a possible thing, is it? The idea of some kind of vaccine pass or vaccine passports or something to ensure that people who are double vaccinated are able to do everything.
Well, we know that some other countries are going to require it. So if you want to go to some other countries, the EU are talking about having it, then it's my job, if you like, as Health Secretary, to make sure that you and everybody else can prove that. And as Mr. Blair said, the technology is very good. In fact, if I could just say this bit, if you download the NHS app right now and register, it will show you your vaccine status, so you can prove that if you want to go to a Greece or somewhere when that is allowed. Currently not.
So we understand very clearly that lots of countries are going to want some form of vaccine passport for travel.
Yeah.
My question is, as Health Secretary, would you like to see that happening here in Britain to allow lots of kinds of hospitality to open up that might otherwise not be able to?
Well, this is subject to the certification review. There are downsides to introducing that, certainly on a mandatory basis. And there's all sorts of challenges to it. It's not the technology that's the problem. And so far, we've proceeded the whole country together. And I think actually that's brought people together, the fact that we've all moved in one step.
How many people will have been fully vaccinated by the 21st of June? Proportion of the country, percentage or something like that?
Fully vaccinated,
yes,
it'll be around 3/5 of all adults. That's not a target, that's my estimate. We're on about 52% of adults as of today. And we're also...
And does it have to be that many to open?
What matters for opening is the data and the link to hospitalisations. The commitment we've got is that all adults, as you know, will be offered the jab by the end of July. Now, what I can tell you is that this week we will open up vaccinations to the under 30s for the first time. So we're making big strides towards that goal of offering a vaccine to all adults. In fact, I'd say that we're getting near to the point that we're offering a vaccine to all adults by opening up to the over 30s this coming week, but we're not quite there yet. And the second jab is so important for everybody to get.
So a huge proportion of the latest cases are in children. Why would that be?
Well, I think there's two reasons. The first is that obviously children are very, very largely unvaccinated unless they have a very specific medical condition. And the second is that we know that there's high transmissibility amongst children, even though they're very unlikely to get ill. Although some children do get long COVID, even though the proportion who actually die from the disease is absolutely vanishingly small.
So here's the real question. Should we be vaccinating children? The Labour Party now says we should be. Tony Blair says we should be. What do you think?
Well, we're taking clinical advice on it. All these decisions are follow the clinical advice.
But the Pfizer vaccine is safe, we're told, for children, and
Safe.
we know it's passing around.
Safe and effective. And there's good advantages, right? There's the reduction in transmission from children to everybody else and adults, like grandparents, for instance, who might be vulnerable. There's the advantage in terms of protecting education, because, you know, if one child tests positive, the whole bubble has to isolate.
So I'm listening to all of this, and I'm asking myself the very, very straightforward question: does Matt Hancock think that children should be vaccinated?
I think that we should follow and listen to clinical advice. We've seen the regulators have said yes, and the clinical advice. I've asked the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations to advise us.
And if they come back and say it's safe, is your policy that children should be vaccinated?
Well, we absolutely should follow clinical advice, but I don't want to put pressure on them one way or the other. They will come forward with their independent advice, and I think that people would want to be assured that whatever steps we take in this space, they are on a clinically advised basis. But I really welcome the fact that the regulator has said that.
So you have to wait for the
safe.
regulator. From what you know at the moment, could this be done before the beginning of the new school year?
Well, you've seen how unbelievably quickly we've been able to roll the vaccine out so far. 40 million doses done in less than 6 months. It's 6 months since the first jab. This week, in fact, and we've done 40 million doses. I don't think anybody would have predicted we would have got that many done.
What do you say to a parent who's watching this and says, you know, I understand all the advantages of vaccinating my child, but we don't really know enough about whether it's going to be safe long term. And my child, what I do know is if he or she is going to catch this disease, they're not going to be terribly ill. So I don't want my child to be vaccinated. It's a risk too far.
Well, we're absolutely not going to make a vaccination mandatory, except in, you know, we're looking at, as you know, for people who work in social care, for instance, where there's a special responsibility and a duty to those they look after. But mandatory isn't our approach overall. And so it is down to individuals to come forward. But the good news, Andrew, as you've seen in the figures, is that people are coming forward in their droves, you know. Over 95% of people over the age of 50 have now come forward. That is absolutely fantastic. And it will help to get us out of this as a nation, the fact the take-up's that high.
But we are not out of this as a nation so far. There's been serious allegations made against you in the House of Commons recently. Can I ask you straightforwardly, have you been honest and transparent with the people and your colleagues during this pandemic?
Yes, of course I have, both internally, in private, and in public, answering more questions from you than probably anybody else over the last year, and in Parliament. That's how I approach the whole thing. So the allegations that you refer to are completely wrong.
Well, I'm referring, of course, to the things that Dominic Cummings said about you in the House of Commons last week. You shrug. You say you didn't see them. You didn't watch. In that spirit of being helpful, I'm just going to play the most serious allegation that I think he made in that moment.
We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Now, do you accept, before we get into the detail of this, that those are very serious allegations by a man who should have known what was going on, who was in the know at the time?
Well, maybe he should have. The situation with respect to care homes is that we brought in the policy of wanting to test everybody who went into a care home as soon as we had those tests available. And look, everybody had a challenge in care homes around Europe, around this country, in Scotland, in Wales as well. Some of the people most vulnerable to COVID live in care homes, and it was a huge challenge. But at the time, you'll remember, because we talked about it extensively, we didn't have the testing capacity, and I built that testing capacity, put in place the 100,000 target, and we got the tests, and then we could implement the policy.
There's a very, very specific allegation. Did you tell the Prime Minister in March that people were not going from hospitals into care homes without being tested at a time when you knew that wasn't true?
Well, ironically here, I did exactly what is alleged, which is we would bring in testing when the testing capacity was available.
So it's a question of tenses. You didn't tell the Prime Minister that people were going from hospitals into care homes without being tested?
Well, throughout, some were tested where there were tests available. That happened throughout. But there were not enough tests available to test everybody. And the clinical advice at the time was that hospital is a dangerous place for people who might end up getting COVID after they've taken the test, but before the result comes through. And anyway, what matters is that you have the infection prevention control when you're in the care home.
We have talked, you're quite right, we've talked an awful lot about this. I am just looking really for a yes or no answer about this, because it's a very straightforward question. Did you tell Boris Johnson in March that people sent from hospitals into care homes were being tested when you knew they weren't?
No, I did not.
Thank you very much indeed for that. So Dominic Cummings was lying about that?
No, because I think that he, in what he just said, he said that people would be. And the truth is, of course, that was the policy to get people those tests available.
All right.
But I had to build this testing capacity. It didn't exist.
So before it existed, were you sending people from hospitals into care homes knowing that they might have COVID and they weren't being tested?
Well, we know absolutely that the testing wasn't available to test everybody. And if you recall at the time, the advice was, the clinical advice was that very few people would be able to pass on COVID if they didn't have any symptoms. So the testing was reserved for those who had symptoms because there was so little testing available.
You said there wasn't the capacity, but on the 27th of March, by the 27th of March, you had the capacity to do 10,000 tests a day. And we're talking in total here about 25,000 people. So if you'd put that, if that had been your focus, you could have done all this testing within 3 days.
No, because we need tests for all sorts of other things as well. Yeah, we need.
But it's priorities, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's other people's lives we needed to save too. So when there isn't enough testing capacity, of course there's challenges and areas where you'd like to use it, and that's why I set the target. So, and if you remember,
was the capacity there? It's a question of where your priority was. 10,000 a day you were doing by then.
No,
we're talking about 25,000 people in total.
So. Just a couple of things on that. The first is the specific accusation which you played was from the start of March, when there wasn't 10,000, there was more like just over 2,000 tests, and it was only because I was driving this testing expansion so much that we ended up with the bigger capacity. But secondly, to say you could test all these people if you did no other tests for 3 days, well, there are other uses for the tests that are just as, if not more, life-saving. What we needed to solve this problem was more tests. And what I did was put in place the target for 100,000 tests, and we hit that target. And others may not have worked towards it, but I drove the whole system, and the whole system responded with this extraordinary expansion of testing capacity, which allowed us to do these critical things.
This is a very solemn issue because we remember how many people died in care homes in the following period. Now, whatever you think of Dominic Cummings, and there's clearly some kind of history between the two of you, he did make a clear personal apology in the House of Commons for his role in that. He said there was a mistake and he was very, very sorry about it, and he apologised to the families involved. Would you do the same?
Well, what I'd say is that at the time, we followed the best clinical advice. And even now, but I know, because I lost a member of my family in the second peak who lived in a care home, okay? So I understand this. I know where people are coming from. I know what it feels like. But what I'd say is that at that time, everybody was working as hard as possible to protect as many lives as possible on the evidence we had at the time. And in fact, this is true across different administrations across this country, across the whole of Europe. And
so you don't regret those decisions?
Well, what I know that those decisions were all taken on the best evidence with the best intentions, even though there were huge challenges that we were facing. And so whilst,
So you say rightly that you've been following the scientific advice, but I remember very vividly at the time there was a lot of talk and a lot of reporting about asymptomatic transmission. It was around, people knew about it. Were you not more worried? Should you not have challenged that advice a bit more? Well, care homes were talking about this too.
Yes, I did challenge that advice, and but But the how we use testing question was one that was critical all the time. Now, one of the other pieces one of the other facts that has now been proven, if you like, by the research that's been done, is that actually it's community transmission.
I'm sorry, we're almost out of time.
Well, it's the community transmission that actually brings the majority of cases in. So again,
there is a debate
testing
about that. Can I ask you one very last question?
It's testing of staff that really matters.
That phrase, protective ring, do you at least regret that?
Well,
it wasn't true, was it?
I said that much later about what we were doing for the winter plan, and it's been interpreted. But there's one other thing before we close that I must say, which is that on testing, which is that tomorrow school children are going back after half term. You must get your tests done this evening. You should have your tests given to you before half term, because right now, children, secondary school age children, getting their tests done tonight is the most important thing that can happen today.
Get your tests done this evening. Matt Hancock, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to you. Thanks to all of my guests. Thanks to you for watching. Until next week, goodbye.